The smell hits you first. Rotting flesh and boiled herbs, mixed with the coppery stench of old blood. It lingers in the velvet drapes, clings to the walls of Whitehall Palace like a curse. And somewhere in the gloom, the most feared monarch in English history is dying, slowly, terribly. His bloated legs are ulcerated and leaking. The screams of his surgeons echo down the corridors as they cut into his infected limbs with knives soaked in wine and superstition. Henry Tudor, once the Golden Prince, the warrior king, the man who split a church in half, now lies alone, weeping into a blood-stained pillow, his body collapsing under the weight of his sins. He is haunted. By wives he condemned, by friends he betrayed, by children he ignored. The crown he fought so viciously to secure now rests heavy on a head clouded with paranoia and ghostly whispers. Every footstep in the hallway sounds like a plot. Every prayer mumbled by his courtiers is laced with fear. No one dares to speak the truth. The king is dying, and with him dies an age of tyranny dressed in silk and ceremony. But this isn't the story told in school books. Not the pageantry of tapestries and treaties. This is the real ending, festering, foul, and full of reckoning. Today, we strip away the myth of Henry VIII and descend into the final decaying days of a man who thought himself God's instrument, only to die as a monster of his own making. The palace smelled wrong, not of perfume nor incense, nor the sacred oils that once clung to the king's robes like invisible armor. It smelled of decay now, sweet, thick rot coiling beneath the rushes, hidden behind embroidered curtains. The corridors whispered with silence, servants moving like ghosts, careful not to breathe too loud, careful not to let their eyes linger too long on the man behind the doors. Behind them lay Henry, the man who once shattered kingdoms with a glance, now could not rise from bed without screaming. His leg, that cursed, monstrous leg, had become something other than human. Flesh blistered and split like overripe fruit. Pus leaked in threads, sour and pink, soaking the linen beneath him. Every motion tore something open. The bandages never stayed clean. Courtiers gagged behind their sleeves, pretending to cough. Physicians argued in whispers, whether to lance deeper or burn more, or stop the bleeding before it drowned him. But Henry would not hear their doubt. His voice, when it came, was thunder still. It erupted from the bed like a curse, roaring commands through pain-clenched teeth. The rage was always worse after nightfall, when the leg throbbed with a heat that felt like punishment. He hadn't walked unaided in months. They dressed him in silence, 5 men to lift him, 6 to brace his limbs. Even the throne had been altered, padded, tilted, surrounded by scent-masking herbs and walls of perfumed cloth. But no barrier could keep the truth away. The court was sick with fear. No one laughed in his presence anymore. No one dared speak of jousts or music. The man who had danced in golden armor was gone. In his place, a shadow drowning in its own flesh. Even his eyes seemed to retreat, clouded with exhaustion, suspicion, and something worse. A flickering awareness of what he had become. Sometimes he wept, not loud, not like a child, but quietly, when the fever rose and his fingers trembled, when the pain burrowed behind his ribs. He wept for lost youth, perhaps, or for the mirror they had removed from his chamber, or for a time when he was not yet a ruin held together by cloth of gold. They feared his body, but they feared his mind more, for even as it decayed, it clung to power with bloody nails. Orders were still signed, arrests still made, executions whispered. No one was safe from his gaze, not even the ones who brought him broth with bowed heads. Kindness was a threat, pity an insult. He could not stand, but he could still destroy, so they smiled. They bowed lower. They praised him with rehearsed awe and stood in the smell of rotting flesh as if it were frankincense. That was the real sickness, not the leg, not the fever, but the ritual of obedience around it. The ritual that kept the kingdom upright, even as its king melted into the mattress. In private, they called him God's anointed. In secret, they called him the wounded beast. But no one dared say aloud what the walls already knew, that the throne was stained now, that the crown, though polished daily, sat above a body collapsing inward, as if some hidden truth had finally begun to bloom beneath the skin, and it was only just beginning to flower. The doors never opened softly. They creaked, groaned, as if the wood itself recoiled from what waited beyond. Men who had once charged into battle now hesitated on the threshold of the royal chamber, hands slick with sweat beneath velvet gloves. They could not afford to look uncertain. Uncertainty was death. Inside, he waited, Henry, swollen, still watching. His eyes did not blink often. They sat heavy in his skull, glistening, yellowed at the edges like old ivory. He did not need to speak to make them tremble. One glance was enough, a gesture, a frown that might mean nothing, or might mean the gallows. No one knew anymore. He had become unreadable, not because he hid himself, but because he had fractured into something else. Each day, a new mood. Each hour, a different cruelty. He could raise a man to lordship in the morning and condemn his son before nightfall. His voice, when it came, was slow now, as though dragged through mud, but it still cut, still commanded, still bled the color from men's faces. They feared his body, yes, but they feared his mind far more, because it remembered. It remembered. Betrayals no one else did, grievances no one dared speak of. A gesture too late, a smile too wide. He stored it all in silence, like a god tallying sins. Every cough, every sideways glance in court became evidence. And so they bent deeper, smiled longer, lied more beautifully. He smelled weakness like rot, and when he found it, when he tasted fear on a man's breath, he would press his finger to parchment and sign away their future. A scroll, a ring, a name struck through. And then, silence. There was no pattern. That was the terror. The game had no rules now. Titles meant nothing. Loyalty was invisible. The only truth was that no one was safe. The nobles, once proud as lions, now slithered like insects. Each man circled the other with a painted face and a blade in his sleeve. The council table, once a place of war-making and policy, had become a theater of masks. Praise poisoned the air. Applause followed even the king's cough. There was no space for thought, only obedience. He enjoyed it. He savored their discomfort, their sweat-drenched courtesy. In his silence, he heard their fear, and it fed him. He could not ride, could not hunt, but he could still command the temperature of every room he entered. And that was enough. The truth was this: the crown feared him now, not the man. Not the corpse unraveling beneath brocade, but the throne he would not release, the power he held in dying hands, the legacy too sharp to approach. Even in decline, he dictated the shape of the court, and each man knew that a single word from the king's cracked lips could blot him out forever. So they bowed, they smiled, and they waited for him to die, with hearts that never stopped. Trembling, but death would not come quickly, and the crown was not ready to be free. He spoke to the dead now, not in madness, not in open delirium, but in murmurs, soft, hoarse, half swallowed by the candlelight. Late at night, when the fire in the hearth burned low and the palace drifted into its strange, hollow quiet, King would stare at the shadows and call them by name, sometimes just one name, sometimes all of them. The women returned not as faces, but as voices. Tones he once commanded now returned unbidden, rising from pillows and tapestries like steam from a wound. He tried to shut them out, pressing his fists to his ears, ordering the windows shuttered, but memory does not obey guards. Anne came. First, she always did Anne, with her eyes like polished glass and a neck bare as winter branches. She had screamed once, not with fear, but with fury. Not for mercy, but for justice. He remembered that. Her words had not begged. They had accused, and still. He had watched the sword fall. Catherine followed. Younger, slower. Her laughter had once spilled through the corridors like bells. He had loved that sound until it turned against him. Until he heard it echoing behind closed doors with other men's names attached to it. He had her stripped, shorn, dragged across the stones while the people watched. She wept before she died. That too, he remembered. The others came in waves. Jane, pale and still, forever holding their sickly son. Catherine of Aragon, whispering. In Latin, refusing to vanish even after exile. Anne of Cleves, quiet, unbroken, eyes that judged but never bowed. Catherine Parr, alive still, but growing smaller in his mind, eclipsed by the ghosts of those who could no longer answer him. They spoke to him when no one else dared. They sat beside his bed when the courtiers fled the stench. They crept into his dreams, not with violence, but with unbearable stillness. He began to dread sleep. He would wake gasping, soaked through, clawing at the sheets as if escaping some velvet tomb. His handmaids learned not to speak, to light more candles, to place rosary beads near his swollen fingers, though he could no longer hold them. In the mirrors, what few remained, he searched not for his reflection, but for theirs. A silhouette, a movement, a shape in the corner that might explain the cold breath on his neck, but there was nothing, only himself rotting, surrounded by silks and gilt. His hands, once steady enough to sign deaths into being, trembled now even at rest. He had called himself God's anointed, defender of the faith, supreme head. But in these nights, alone with 6 silent queens, he began to wonder if the God he spoke of had ever answered back, or if he had been speaking only to himself all along. And now they had come, not for vengeance, but for balance, for what had been taken, for what could never be returned, for what could not be rewritten in stone. He was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of what would still be waiting when death came. The crib had long been removed. No lullabies echoed in the corridors. No nursemaids hummed behind the walls. The nursery windows were shuttered, the toys boxed, the air stale with stillness. Even the paintings of princes, bright-cheeked, cherubic, seemed to fade into dust. The future Henry had bled kingdoms for had become a whisper in an empty room. Edward lived, but not truly. He was thin as reeds, pale as ash, fragile in every sense that mattered. When Henry looked at him, really looked, he did not see. Heir to an empire, he saw something borrowed, something that might break. The boy's chest rose with effort. His cough was like splinters. The crown fitted for his future already felt too heavy for his skull. This was the son he had torn the world open to create, the son for whom wives had been cast aside, executed, erased, the son for whom fires had burned monasteries, for whom entire families were made to vanish, so that one child might rise from the smoke like a promise. But promises made in blood rarely last. Henry sat alone now, surrounded by tapestries depicting mighty lions and radiant suns, and wondered if the stars had mocked him from the start. He had taken his hunger and cloaked it in holy language, declared it divine right, sacred duty. But beneath the Latin prayers and royal decrees had always been the same simple fear, that he would die without a name to follow his own. He said it was about lineage, legacy, God's will, but really, it had always been about the quiet terror of vanishing. Men spoke of succession as though it were stone, but Henry knew better. Succession was smoke. It slipped between fingers. And when grasped too tightly, it cut. The boy was watched constantly. Every cough brought a physician. Every fever sparked a wave of silence. They dared not say it aloud, but they all knew the tutor line hung from a single fraying thread, and no one, not even the king, knew how long it could hold. He had daughters, sharp-minded, cold-eyed, but he had taught the court that daughters did not matter. That women were not legacy, only detours. And now he sat in the wreckage of that belief, surrounded by ghosts he had made himself. There was no joy in it anymore, no triumph, only the gnawing emptiness of a man who had demanded the universe bend to his desire and received a child, too fragile to carry his sins. He had once believed himself eternal through blood. Now, even his blood seemed to recoil from him. Each day, he stared into the fire, into the faces of sons he never had. A line of boys who never lived past the first breath, each one a sacrifice to his fear. And in the end, the altar stood bare. He had won, he had a son, and yet he felt more forgotten with each passing hour. The silence around him was no longer reverent. It was sharp, breathless, weighted with the fear of saying the wrong name or remembering the wrong face. Trust had not left the room. It had been hunted out of it. Henry no longer spoke in conversation. He interrogated. His voice, low and cracked, asked simple things, but each question was a trap with no exits. Who visited whom? Who paused before bowing? Who looked at whom during Mass? These were no longer courtly observations. They were accusations in disguise, and he listened to the answers with eyes that searched for betrayal like a hound sniffs blood. He had begun to believe that everyone had betrayed him, that the men who once knelt before him did so now with knives hidden in their robes. Loyalty was not protection. It was camouflage. The more they swore their devotion, the more he was convinced they lied. Thomas Howard had eaten at his table. For years, the Duke had served through wars and executions, had smiled while blood ran in fountains from scaffold steps. But even Howard's pedigree could not shield him from the king's rotting doubt. A whisper here, a cousin's ambition there, and suddenly the man was stripped of title and freedom, locked in the tower where Henry had sent so many others. There were no farewells, just ink on parchment and the quiet tightening of doors. Bishop Gardiner came next, the king's spiritual mouthpiece. A man of scripture, fire, and folded hands. He had once been trusted with secrets too dangerous to utter. But secrets rot, and Henry began to wonder whose ears had heard what they shouldn't. The bishop was watched, sidelined, stained with suspicion. Not dead, not yet, but erased in pieces. Henry had stopped seeing men. He saw only threats in breathing form. The council shrank. Rooms grew colder. Conversations dulled to ritual. Every robe, every ring, every hand that touched the royal seal became suspect. He changed servants weekly, burned letters unopened. He even had tapestries removed from his chambers, claiming they whispered too loudly when he tried to sleep, and still the paranoia sharpened. This was no longer the rule of a king. It was the reign of a dying god who believed the world itself conspired against him. And if it hadn't, then it soon would. Better then to strike first, to erase before being erased, to become the executioner again, not the victim, but somewhere. Deep beneath the fever and rot, even Henry knew the truth. He had raised a kingdom on fear, built a court from silence, rewarded obedience not with safety, but with a longer rope. And now the last loyal men stood at a distance, their eyes lowered, their prayers empty. He had made executioners of them all, and now he sat alone among the ruins of names he had once called brother, friend, guardian, all of them gone. He waited, surrounded by ghosts in fine clothing, and in the stillness, he began to wonder if power could not save him from isolation, then what exactly had it ever saved him from? The bells no longer rang the same. They echoed off hollow walls now, unanchored, uncertain, forgotten. In the villages, the chapels stood colder, their altars bare, their saints scraped from stone, where once candles had flickered before relics, and hymns soaked the rafters. There was only silence now. Or worse, confusion, bitter and dry in the mouth. This was Henry's England, an England where faith had been melted down for coin, where monks had been dragged from their cloisters like criminals, their chants replaced with the clink of hammers, dismantling sanctuaries brick by brick. The sacred had become property. Monasteries were not dissolved. They were gutted, flayed, hung for display, and the people watched. Some took, some knelt, some burned with shame they dared not name. The fields where abbeys once stood now bore sheep and smoke. Names were forgotten, books turned to ash, bones scattered in haste. Entire generations of prayer erased in the name of royal supremacy, a crown placed higher than God and sharpened with law. He had called it reform, but it had been conquest in velvet robes. And now, in his final days, the man who split the soul of a nation in two could no longer remember what it had been like to believe in anything but himself. The clergy who remained were thinner, their vestments dull, their words rehearsed. They looked to the king not as a shepherd, but as an executioner in disguise. They spoke his gospel with eyes lowered, terrified that even silence might be interpreted as treason. He had become both head of the church and its gravedigger, even in the north, where traditions had held longer, like frost that refuses to melt. Crosses were pulled from chapels in the dark, processions stopped, pilgrimages halted. What had once been passed through blood and bread was now forbidden by signature. There were those who resisted, quietly, desperately, but rebellion had its own altar, and Henry lit it with fire. He gave them a choice, obedience or extinction, and most chose to live, to whisper their faith in cellars and barns, to pray behind closed doors, in the shadows of what used to be. And in that shadow, something died, not just a church, not just a ritual, but the quiet thread that had once tied the kingdom to its soul. That invisible, fragile thing called meaning, dissolved as surely as the monasteries had been. What remained was an England that bowed in body, but fractured in spirit. And now, Henry lay dying in a palace that echoed with the ghosts of prayers he had outlawed. He had declared himself supreme head, yet he could not command peace to return. He had taken sacredness and named it treason, but still his bed stank of rot. His titles stacked high, but none of them could name the thing he had lost. It was not God who had vanished. It was awe. It was mystery. It was the silence that once felt full, and now it was just silence. Cold, empty, echoing louder with each breath he failed to draw. The ink had to be warmed before it touched the parchment. His fingers were too stiff now, too swollen. He could no longer hold the quill without it trembling in betrayal. So others wrote for him, elegant hands from men with careful voices. But the words were his, always his. Each one dictated like scripture. He was building a monument, not of stone, but of paper and gold leaf. A final version of himself, stitched together with flattery and ceremonial deceit. In this portrait, he was not the butcher of wives or the destroyer of abbeys. He was the scholar king, the father of a new England, the sacred hinge between heaven and crown. He wore robes of righteousness in these paintings. His leg did not rot. His crown did not tilt. His eyes did not betray their fog. This Henry, the Henry in ink and oil, stood straight, eternal, unblemished. It was a lie, and everyone knew it, but no one dared tell him. The scribes bent low. The artists brushed his fading features with reverence. Priests stitched blessings into their sermons, using his name like an offering. Every decree, every dedication, Every coin pressed with his likeness carried the same silent agreement. Pretend. Pretend he was still the man who broke Rome. Pretend the world still bent to his breath. Pretend the blood on his hands had been necessary. He demanded a great funeral, one worthy of an emperor. Choirs would sing. Trumpets would rise. The dead would pause in their graves to weep for the passing of a legend. And through it all, the mask would remain unbroken. But behind the silks, something faltered. He could feel it. In the way, the fire didn't warm him anymore. In the way, the courtiers bowed too quickly, said too little, left too soon. They spoke of legacy, yet shuffled his words into storage the moment he slept. They watched him the way one watches a fire run low, not with fear, but with calculation. Still, he clung to the page. The orders, the rehearsals. He believed if the lie was repeated enough, it would outlive the truth. That history could be bribed, as so many men had been, but the truth sat quietly at the edge of his bed, like a priest refused entry. It did not shout. It did not curse. It simply waited while he signed false declarations of love to his children, waited while he approved portraits that erased his limp, waited while he dictated prayers he did not mean to a God who no longer answered. He had rewritten the world to serve his reflection. Now that reflection began to dissolve, and no one dared meet his eyes as he vanished inside it, the legend was almost complete. But in the silence between signatures, when the quill paused and the oil dried, a deeper story pressed against this. Walls, wordless, bitter, and real, and it would not stay buried. No bells rang. No town criers moved through the streets. No torches were lit. No mourning cloth hung from palace windows. The sky remained black, starless, unmoved, and the king was dead. He died in silence, the way tyrants never expect to die. Not with a scream, not with a final command, but with a rattle lost in the folds of thick curtains, swallowed by velvet and secrecy. No great council gathered at his bedside. No priest held his hand. No child kissed his brow. His final breath vanished into the dark, unmarked, unrecorded, unblessed. It was not how he had written it. He had envisioned choirs and angels, a death scene painted in gold and reverence. But in the end, the room was heavy with sweat and spoiled. Heir. The fire had burned down to embers. The body beneath the sheets did not look royal. It looked empty, slack, quiet. The flesh had stopped resisting itself, and the kingdom did not know. They kept the doors locked. The servants were warned. The sheets removed. The body washed in secrecy. The rot had begun already, faint, metallic, slow, and the physicians whispered of how long they had before the smell spread. Even in death, they feared him. They feared what his passing might ignite. Which noble might rise, which child might vanish, which border might break. So they told no one, not the court, not the foreign embassies, not even the boy who now bore the crown in name only. They moved like thieves, tiptoeing around a corpse that had once commanded storms. He had taught them this. He had taught them that power was control, and control was silence. And so, his own death became a ritual of obedience, a delay, a performance, a lie extended for just a few days more. There would be time for grief later, for ceremony, for procession and hymn. But not yet. Not while the crown still trembled on the table. Not while his enemies were still alive. Not while the throne sat unclaimed, still warm from the weight of him. No one dared enter the chamber alone. They left him under candlelight, in robes too, fine for the stench of death, his mouth slightly parted as if preparing to speak again. But there were no more decrees, no more names to strike, just the stillness of a man who had ruled too long to be remembered kindly. Outside, the wind rose. It moved through the palace like a breath held too long. down stone corridors, through locked doors, past empty beds, past guards who stared ahead, eyes glassed with the knowledge they could not speak. The king had died, but no one had seen it. No one had marked the moment. No one had said the words aloud. And in that silence, his power lingered, thick and spectral, a final warning in the air. Even in death, Henry ruled, and the world held its breath, unsure if it was truly safe to exhale. The smell came first, not loud, not sudden, just a quiet sickness in the air, sweet at the edges, metallic at the core, like something once sacred curdling in secret, the kind of scent that seeps into wood, into cloth, into breath. It followed the coffin before anyone dared look inside. They had packed the body in haste, wrapped it in linen, sealed it in lead, dressed it in robes stitched with the symbols of power, lions, swords, crosses. But no symbol could hold back the swelling. The flesh did what flesh always does. It rose. It ruptured. They said the heat had bloomed too fast, that the journey was too long, that the seal had failed. But beneath the excuses was the truth no one wanted to speak. The king was rotting from the inside out, and when the box burst open, not with violence, but with the soft, wet bloom of pressure finally uncoiled, the procession halted in stillness. The guards turned their faces. The priests gagged behind incense. Blood and pus soaked the silk lining. The royal belly, bloated beyond recognition, had split. The scent was no longer faint. It became a presence. A second ghost. They remembered the prophecy then, the insult spoken years before, half laughed at. The time that he would die like a beast, and that dogs would lick his blood from the ground. A curse hurled in rage, dismissed as treason. But now, here it was, the warning made flesh. The coffin leaking, the body failing to stay obedient. There were no hymns then, no noble speeches, just silence. Heavy, complicit. The wheels turned slower. No one spoke of glory anymore. This was not a death to inspire. It was a death to erase, but the land had already changed its shape. The people remembered the monasteries burned, the executions, the daughters disinherited, the endless marriages, the discarded queens. They remembered how faith had been traded for coin, how silence had been sold as loyalty. They looked at the road behind the coffin and saw not the path of a great king, but the trail of something spoiled, and the crown, though polished, though kissed, though claimed by the next, felt colder because his rot was not just of the body. It lived in the laws, in the palaces, in the way men bowed without meaning it, in the way fear lingered. Years after the voice that birthed it had fallen silent, they would bury him beneath marble, they would carve prayers above the wound, they would paint him clean in portraits, polished and defiant. But nothing could undo what the flesh had done. The rupture was final. The lie had leaked, and all the silk in England could not soak it back in. And somewhere, beneath layers of stone and scripture, the corpse of the king would continue to swell, quiet, hidden, unfinished, just like the kingdom he left behind.